So about a year ago when Inside Job first released, I downloaded it in advance of an important work trip where I would be flying for a couple of hours. I get pretty motion sick on plane rides, so it's important that I have something on television or Netflix that I can download and watch so that I don't vomit all over my fellow passengers. Inside Job seemed right up my alley. I watched the trailer, it looked amazing. It looked exactly like the kind of thing I normally like, both in genre and the fact that I love animation. But I hated it. Inside Job actually was going to have the honor of being the very first show I ever tore to shreds on this channel. I try to be positive. I try to only cover things I really like. But I was stuck on a plane, miserable, watching this show I really didn't enjoy. And it made me hate it, maybe a little bit more than was appropriate. I spent my downtime during that trip writing a script where I tore Inside Job to pieces. And then on the way back, I was going to watch something else. However, to my horror, I found when I got on the plane that I had forgotten to swap out my downloads. So the only choice I had was to watch Inside Job again. And I was very surprised to find that I really enjoyed Inside Job the second time. This week, Inside Job Part 2 came out, and I watched Part 1 again, a third time, in preparation for it. And at this point, I'd proudly call myself a huge Inside Job fan. I love it. So I want to talk a little bit today about this show and what works and what doesn't work, but specifically I want to break down the narrative. I'm going to be honest, there are parts of this show that I described in my first iteration of these notes a year ago as fucking mediocre, which is a level of vitriol I normally only reserve for James Patterson. However, once I was able to get in tune with the sense of humor and what the show was actually trying to do, those concerns really faded away. This show isn't trying to be Game of Thrones, but it is trying to do some things that I really like. We're going to do a little bit of review and a lot of analysis, so if you're looking for somebody to tell you how bad Inside Job sucks, please just watch a different video. So what is Inside Job? Inside Job is an adult cartoon made by Shion Takeuchi, who is an alumni of Gravity Falls. Gravity Falls is considered to be one of the greatest animated series of all time. In fact, I watched it when I was in college as the series was coming out. And as much as I enjoyed Gravity Falls, well, that's really the problem. I would give it about a 7 or an 8 for me personally. I recognize everything that made it amazing, but the sense of humor just didn't really line up with mine. I love conspiracy theories and all that kind of stuff, but a lot of the jokes just didn't work on me. There were many other things at the time that I found more interesting, specifically because I'm a huge fan of sci-fi. A lot of people were very disappointed when Inside Job came out, that it's not closer to Gravity Falls, especially because it had creator Alex Hirsch's name plastered all over the marketing material. Maybe not all over, but just enough that people got the wrong idea. People were expecting Inside Job to be Gravity Falls, and it simply isn't. It's not trying to be. For example, one major component of Gravity Falls that people were expecting to be carried over into Inside Job was the inclusion of secret codes in blink and you'll miss it frames. That kind of thing simply doesn't exist here. There are a lot of jokes that exist in a single frame. There are a lot of references that you have to zoom in really far to be able to catch, but none of them will give you a hint as to a wider plot twist or telling you what the ending is going to be in season 1. That's not to say that the ending isn't planned out, it's just that this series isn't nearly as much about some greater plot. It's a comedy and a character study, and the character study really mostly only applies to 2 or 3 people. On top of that, Inside Job tries to separate itself from its pedigree by emphasizing the fact that it is an adult show through repeated over-the-top sex jokes that many of which are funny and some of which simply aren't. There's a character named Mike, whom we'll get to later, who is a mushroom with 6 or 8 tentacles, all of which are dicks. And the joke is that all of his tentacles are each dicks, and if you touch one, you touched his dick. Wow. Hilarious. But this character worked on some people. But jokes about Mike's dicks aside, I appreciate the fact that adult animation is becoming something you can actually watch for reasons other than porn. One of my favorite shows in college, if not my favorite show, was Steven Universe, a show that is probably actually for 6-year-old girls. It had an incredible sci-fi plot, but half the time I was watching it, I was really, really embarrassed about the fact that the rest of the audience was probably in elementary school. Inside Job does not make me feel like that. Shut up, Discord. Inside Job does not make me feel like that. But why did I like Inside Job? As far as personal tastes go, I have a hard time getting into anything with self-insert or flat protagonists. I didn't have a real issue with Sword Art Online, for example, when that was coming out, for any of the moral reasons that I now have an issue with Sword Art Online. But I was bored out of my mind because Kirito isn't a person. I can tolerate The Matrix, I see the appeal, but when I watch it, I can't stop thinking about the fact that Neo is supposed to be projected on by the entire audience. I really only find myself getting invested in media that has a well-written, strongly characterized protagonist, whatever that protagonist looks like, whether they're old, young, good, or evil, sympathetic or unsympathetic. Because the thing is, I'm a cynical, Prius-driving government roboticist who pretty much believes that everything is fake. There's not a lot of characters that look exactly like me, which is why I was really shocked when I didn't immediately love Inside Job. Inside Job is about Reagan Ridley, an extremely cynical, Prius-driving government roboticist who not only believes everything is fake, but creates those fake parts of society. Reagan works for the Deep State, which in this universe is a company called Cognito, Inc. Cognito controls both sides of the news media. They put satanic messages in children's cartoons. They control the president, and they look at everybody's Tinder profiles to get dick pics that they can use to later blackmail important members of Congress. Reagan's father, Rand, is also a roboticist who was a founding member of Cognito. He was kicked out of the company a few years prior and is currently living on Reagan's couch. During this time, Reagan has been preparing to eventually take over the company, and on the first episode, she is promoted to second in command. However, Reagan's single-minded focus on work has left her with a somewhat unpalatable personality. She's had numerous HR complaints, she doesn't really get along with any of her employees, and she's generally considered to be an unpleasant person. For this reason, on the day that Reagan is promoted to second in command of Cognito, she is co-promoted with unpaid intern Brett Hand, a overly friendly former frat boy who is much more palatable to her coworkers, but also much less experienced. After not getting along for roughly 2 minutes in the first episode, Reagan and Brett become very close friends. The show is about Reagan and Brett learning to lead Cognito, both together and as individuals, but it's mostly about Reagan. In the first season, it's very clear that Reagan isn't ready to take over as CEO, but as the show goes on, we see her develop into someone who is much better at making important decisions and is willing to face problems head on. I do want to take a moment before we get into the real narrative analysis to talk about some of the things that I thought were a little bit weak about the show. I think it's important to address these just because they were so important to my initial assessment of the series. So for one, most glaringly, the show has a serious show-don't-tell problem. We are told, for example, repeatedly that Reagan is ugly. Both men and women who are higher in social station than her say that she's a 4 or say that she's hard to look at. However, in other episodes, there are men falling at her feet, including the James Bond equivalent, Rafe Masters, who becomes obsessed with her, tries to move in with her, that kind of thing. Brett initially is characterized as this immensely likable person whose ability to get along with anyone he meets is the skill he brings to the team. However, a few episodes later, it's revealed that his frat brothers didn't actually like him and they were just pretending to be his friend because they thought it was funny. These two qualities don't really coexist, actually, and I wish that the reason why they did was explored or explained in any way. In the first 5 minutes, we're told that Reagan has difficulty with eye contact, but we never actually see this. She always appears to be making eye contact with people when she's talking to them, and she's incredibly direct and blunt. But the biggest problem is with Reagan and Brett's team, the crew. The team consists of these 4 characters who are each department heads in their own right. Mike, a mushroom person whose jizz allows Cognito to erase people's memories. Gigi, a social media expert who is controlling the entire infotainment industry. Andre, a chemist who creates drugs. And oh my god, I forgot his name, the dolphin guy. He is a former general of the military who underwent surgery to mix his DNA with that of a dolphin, and now he's a human monstrosity. Dolphin guy inside job. Glenn Dolphin. Glenn. I've seen this show 3 times. A lot of Reagan's character development is supposed to have to do with her relationship with her team. Repeatedly, she is made to choose between staying at Cognito and benefiting her mental health by leaving. However, she chooses her team and they choose her back, only for them to, a few episodes later, betray her in some big way because she had betrayed them first. This up and down of their relationship is well explained in the show on Reagan's part, but not on the part of the rest of the team. The finale of the first season has to do with Reagan affirming her connection with her team, but it really doesn't feel earned, and I couldn't put my finger on why until season 2. In season 1, Reagan is accepted by the rest of her team after the 2nd episode, before which she was considered too grating to really hang out with them. We see her spending time with the rest of the team all at once, but in season 2, we see Reagan spending a lot of one-on-one time with Gigi, the only other female member of her group. This one-on-one connection in the 2nd season made me realize that this is what we were missing in the 1st season. The only person in the group that Reagan has any one-on-one character development with is Brett. And I care a lot about Reagan's connection with Brett, but I couldn't care about her connection with, say, Glenn, because I'm not actually sure they ever interacted. This goes back to the one thing I keep harping on this channel, which is that television these days is too short. In the case of part 2 of Inside Job, I expected it to be 10 episodes like season 1, and when I got to the end of episode 8, the credits started rolling, and I was shocked and disappointed. But on top of that, we may never get any more Inside Job, and the story doesn't feel nearly fleshed out enough for it to be considered over. Previous television series like MASH or Supernatural, now obviously outliers because they lasted 15+ seasons apiece, were able to have episodes where nothing happened or very little happened because they had enough time to tell them. Unfortunately, Netflix's get in and get out, tell your story as quickly as possible model is actually impacting the writing. One thing that people complain a lot about with Inside Job is the amount of lampshading they do. Many times they will move through a plot really quickly and then they say, haha, we just moved through that plot really quickly. For example, the first episode of part 2, Reagan meets, has friction with, and then sleeps with this guy named Ron, who is her love interest for the 2nd part. They throw a lampshade on this by saying, haha, enemies to lovers trope, isn't that so overdone? A lot of people felt that this was rushed, but unfortunately this is the Netflix storytelling style. If part 2 had been 16 episodes long, we could have gotten a whole lot more build-up about the relationship between Reagan and Ron. But it didn't happen because there simply wasn't enough time. We had to get Reagan to the point where she is in part 2, episode 8, in order for that part to make sense. And the only way you can do that is by getting her in a relationship with Ron as quickly as possible. So I'm not frustrated with the amount of lampshading that the dialogue does. On top of that, the show is acknowledging to the audience that they should be paying attention. When they say, we know we did this last season, literally in the script, they are saying, please keep using your mind when you watch this. I like to think of Inside Job as a kind of turn your brain off show for people like me who can't really turn our brains off. I've seen a couple stoner shows in my life and I turned them off. Inside Job is not a stoner show. It's a show with a lot of rapid fire jokes, only some of which actually have to do with the plot. If you miss a couple lines of dialogue, it's okay, but you are expected to be watching and listening the whole time. And I think that that fills an important niche in the market. There's not really another show like Inside Job that I can think of at the moment. And there could be a reason for that, but I do enjoy what Inside Job has to offer. So now I want to talk about the actual story. There's a model of analyzing literature that I came up with during the last project that I was doing for this channel that honestly feels like a cheat code for analyzing literature. And that model I like to call all stories are love triangles. Now that is a bit of an oversimplification, but let me start by explaining a concept that I learned in engineering school. So when I was in engineering school, I had to take a class called statics. Statics is about the forces present in things that do not move. What kind of forces exist on a bridge when there are no cars on it? How much weight is on each of these pillars and all that kind of stuff. And I can summarize the gist of statics to you right now in the next 2 sentences. You quantify all of the forces acting on a single point. So you've got maybe 5 pounds of force in this direction, and 10 pounds of force in this direction, 15 pounds of force in this direction. You add them up and you see what the difference is. If you have 5 pounds of force in this direction and 10 pounds of force in this direction, you have a net 5 pounds of force in this direction because you're subtracting 5 pounds from this direction, right? Maybe I should have used less round numbers, but I hope you get it. The forces that push and pull on an object are all summed together in the 3 cardinal directions: up and down, left and right, forward and backwards, the dimensions, sorry. That is how I tend to think of characters now. So when I say that all stories are love triangles, what I mean is that typically a single character, especially in a show that is about a single character and not an ensemble, that character's arc has to do with choosing between 2 ideologies, each of which is encapsulated by a character in the narrative. A really easy example to understand is The Hunger Games. In The Hunger Games, the main character Katniss has to choose between Gale, a cynical hunter whom she grew up with, who is very, very much like her, and Peeta, a boy who is much more idealistic and who represents hope. In the end, Katniss goes with Peeta, not necessarily out of a greater attraction towards him, but because the narrative demands that Katniss choose hope for her own survival in a world that is as dark as the world in The Hunger Games. So if you want to be able to predict who a character is going to end up with in a love triangle, all you have to do is look at what they represent. Inevitably, invariably, one of them represents an unhealthy coping mechanism that they need to get away from, but is comforting to them, and the other one represents stepping out of their comfort zone into something that is healthier. In the case of The Hunger Games, obviously Gale is the unhealthy coping mechanism due to his cynicism, and Peeta represents stepping out of her comfort zone of cynicism into hope. I chose Hunger Games because it's really, really easily translated into the love triangle that we have in Inside Job. In Inside Job, that love triangle isn't romantic. It's Regan being pulled between the 2 forces in her life that are most important to her emotionally, her father and Brett. I want to take a moment to note something about Regan's father, Rand. I really don't like using the word narcissist. I believe that it's grossly overused to the point of abuse. You can do anything to an ex that you claim is a narcissist, because in the eyes of everyone who hears that, what they hear is that this person has no soul, and therefore any punishment is appropriate. It's an excuse for people to feel better about themselves by identifying as a victim and feeling that they couldn't have possibly done anything wrong because the person involved is a narcissist, a black hole of evil that could not possibly have had anything positive going on. That being said, Rand Ridley is a textbook case of what most viewers would call a narcissist. Rand Ridley lives with Regan, and as the series goes on, it's revealed that he was a more and more fucked up dad than we were really expecting. At the beginning, he's just an alcoholic lowlife who pulls a bunch of stupid stunts in order to get Regan's attention. But throughout the season, it's revealed that throughout Regan's life, he has been Swiss cheesing her memory in order to create the perfect future CEO of Cognito. Every time she saw him do something unpleasant, every time she made a friend with someone he considered unworthy or who just plain wasn't him, he erased them from her mind. Anything that wasn't perfect for Regan's upbringing in Rand's eyes had to be removed. But I do want to remind viewers, in light of what happened in part 2, that Rand was introduced as caring about what Regan thinks, but displaying it in an unhealthy way. He does actually want Regan's genuine love, but he's so attached to his identity as an achiever that he's unwilling to admit that he could care, at least until later when he realizes that he truly has nothing. Additionally, at one point it's mentioned that Rand in the womb adjusted Regan's DNA to be closer to him than to her mother, Tamiko. Regan is, at the start of the story, extremely similar to her father. They are both extremely cynical. They both can tend towards alcoholism. They're both roboticists working at the same company doing the same job. And Rand represents that one leg of the love triangle who represents the unhealthy coping mechanism. Regan isn't supposed to make friends, she's supposed to hate everyone. So who is the other side of the love triangle? It's Brett, Regan's best friend and co-manager. Brett is described repeatedly as the human equivalent of a golden retriever. He may not actually have any skills that would make him qualified for this job, but he's so kind and so giving that everybody likes him. But in the narrative, everything good for Regan's mental health comes from Brett. He literally recommends her to the therapy group that she attends, which introduces her to her love interest, Ron. He teaches her numerous lessons in leadership that allow her to become a better boss, both on purpose and by accident. He facilitates the connection with her coworkers that makes Regan's relationship with her job much healthier. He is the one person that Barrow does not identify as being a negative force in Regan's life at the end of part 1. The thing is, if Rand hadn't done any of the things he did to Regan, the mind altering, the forcing her to go to a higher grade than she was ready for and all of that, the quote-unquote worst possible outcome she could have faced was becoming like Brett, someone uneducated, too connected to the world, and mostly incapable of fending for himself. But Brett is much happier than Regan is. Yeah, Brett isn't necessarily the happiest person out there, but between the two of them, the one who wins the mental health award is clearly Brett. The point is that what Rand has been doing to Regan her entire life is bad. We see the absence of it in Brett, and we see that if she gets away from Rand's influence and becomes more like Brett, that would be beneficial for her. In fact, over the course of the series, all of Regan's choices where she is acting more like Brett and showing the influence that she has gotten from Brett, those are her positive choices. Those are her directions of growth that are positive. There is definitely an open question of whether Regan will end up with Brett romantically. I actually don't know. when I watched part 1, I was very certain the answer was yes, because of this narrative analysis. I'm not sure if she'll ever end up with him romantically at this point, because we just had this whole season of her being with Ron, but I do stand by the fact that she has to end up with Brett at the end of this story in some way. For example, at the end of season 1, or at the end of season 1 part 2, she goes back to Brett, hugs him, and they walk down the hallway together, talking about the future of how they will lead Cognito. That must be the ending, whether they are together as a couple or not. There have been a few hints that Brett is not into Reagan, but it's in such a way that I'm not sure if it's trying to be plausibly deniable or not. He jokes a couple of times that the connection between him and Reagan is platonic, but it's said in a way that I really can't ascribe any meaning to it, because it could be denial. I'm not sure, and I'm not willing to make a call. In fact, I kind of think the writers haven't necessarily made a decision either. But either way, at the start of part 1, Reagan is 60% of the way to being her dad. She's isolated, she's cynical, and throughout season 1, she veers closer and closer to Brett and being like Brett, and for Brett to win. But at the end of season 1, sorry, part 1, good God, Rand literally wins. He takes the promotion away from Reagan and reveals to her that she was always his insurance policy to get back into the company. And at the beginning of season 2, the actual first scene is Reagan recreating the opening scene with her dad, but her taking her dad's place, and Brett taking Reagan's place. Everyone in the chain of command has moved up one with the removal of JR, and so everybody's places in the narrative have been shifted. JR has become the unpaid intern replacing Brett. Brett has become Reagan, both in the fact that he leads the team under Reagan, and in the fact that he is the person Reagan, who represents Rand, is manipulating throughout the season for her own personal gain. Although she does so to a much lesser degree than her father ever did to her. I do want to take a moment to acknowledge something else that I really liked about the show, and that is its commitment to ambiguity. For example, in the first episode, it's basically explicitly stated that the reason that Brett was put onto the team is so that JR could have somebody who is more like him on that team to make him feel more comfortable and so that he can control. However, it is very clear throughout the series that Brett genuinely does help Reagan lead and help her be a better person. So despite the negative circumstances of his hiring, you can't really say that it would have been better if he hadn't been hired. In the episode where Gigi is manipulating the media, which she does all the time, but part 2, episode 5 or 4, which is about Brett becoming a candidate for senator, we see that Gigi is manipulating both sides of the political media sphere, showing that the real enemy is infotainment and the way that the media manipulates the way you care about things by showing you the same examples over and over again, making you forget about things that happened a few weeks ago because it's no longer considered important. I would consider myself a hopeful nihilist, and I really appreciate the ethos of this series, which we're going to get to right now when we start talking about season 2. I'm sorry, part 2. So in part 2, Reagan's position as CEO has been stolen by her father, which has driven her to alcoholism and generally just not being a very good employee. Brett suggests she go to group therapy, where she meets a young man named Ron Statler, who is also there from his position in the Illuminati. Over the course of the season, Reagan and Ron fall in love. However, Ron is constantly haunted by his job at the Illuminati. He's not only mistreated by his coworkers, but his job is really morally miserable. He wipes people's minds, which parallels him really, really strongly with Rand. I mentioned that because of Rand's victory in the last season, morally, Rhaegan has been moved over to where Rand was on the line, where Brett is here and Rhaegan was here and Rand was here. Rhaegan got moved over to where Rand is. So the goalposts have been moved. And Ron now represents Rand. He's on the other side, farther than Rand was in certain ways. Now, he's obviously much more positive a force in Rhaegan's life than Rand was, but he still represents that unhealthy coping mechanism that Rhaegan has always had, which is retreating away from society, not dealing with other people, and resorting to hopeless cynicism. At the end of the season, Ron decides he wants to run away to a town called Appleton, where he intends for he and Rhaegan to erase their own minds, start over as husband and wife, build a life together. Rhaegan ultimately decides that he deserves to have this life, but she wipes his mind and leaves him there to find his own happiness with someone else. We'll get there. I do want to start out my discussion of Ron by saying something about science fiction and life in general. When you erase someone's whole memory, you erase their whole self. That is death. That's killing them and spinning random numbers to get a new person. Ron introduces himself in episode 1 as trying to drink a whole vat of memory fluid. I forget the exact phrasing, but it's played as a suicide attempt, and it should be seen as such. So at the end of the season, when he holds the gun to his head and pulls the trigger, it's not an actual bullet, but you are supposed to understand that Ron Statler is dead, and he was taken over by that other guy, who is going to be a completely new person. The reason he and Rhaegan were going to work was because they were reading each other's scripts that said they were a happy couple, brainwashing themselves into be happy together. The first thing we learn about Ron is that he judges people extremely harshly, more harshly than Rhaegan ever did. When Rhaegan and Ron meet in therapy, he immediately outs her to everyone else as the privileged princess figure daughter of Rand. He never considers the fact that she could be in legitimate emotional pain until after they start sleeping together. He doesn't assume empathy by default. This is really just flavoring that shows us, foreshadows to us, that he isn't the perfect person for Rhaegan. Whether that person is Brett or not, this is an argument for Brett. This is explaining why she cannot be with Ron. In episode 5 or 6, in one of the episodes in season 2, Rhaegan introduces him to Brett, and Ron's intense, not like other girls characterization immediately causes him and Brett to have problems. He starts talking about how he doesn't like people who were in frats or dude bros or people who like 90s music, which are all things that describe Brett. And Ron becomes the first person in the entire series that Brett truly dislikes. Although they do make up at the end of the episode, the fact that Brett doesn't like Ron is a red flag. Though the fact that Ron is actively hostile to Brett specifically is a red flag, because Brett represents Rhaegan's optimism and hope for humanity and desire to help people. And Ron attacking that shows us that he's attacking that same quality in Rhaegan. As the series goes forward, Rhaegan tries to get Ron to work with her at Cognito, because Rhaegan has never actually considered leaving Cognito. Barrow has tried to get her to leave, and I do think at the end of the series, Rhaegan will have to leave, but she loves her job. She wants to be there. She's made it work with the coworkers she has, and she's been improving both as a boss and as a coworker every episode. But Ron doesn't see that as important. Ron wants to run away, and he wants Rhaegan to run away with him. The thing that's most important to Reagan in the whole wide world, building robots, is not something that matters to him. Not the robots part, but the fact that it's important to Reagan doesn't matter to him. Ron is the final form of what Barrow was afraid of for Reagan. At the end of season 1, there is a big fight between Barrow, a robot built by Rand during Reagan's childhood to try to get her to be a better CEO. That fight is against Robotus, a robot that Reagan built to try to prove that she can be CEO. Barrow wanted Reagan to quit her job and wanted to kill most of her coworkers because Reagan was working herself to the bone for no reward. She was abusing substances, she had an extremely unhealthy social life, and she was generally miserable all of the time. Ron represents the final form of what Barrow was concerned about for Reagan. He's a burned-out scientist overworked by an unappreciating evil organization full of people who treat him like shit until he becomes a bitter, hopeless shell of a person. In the final episode, he says something that cements his status as antithetical to the endgame of Reagan's character development. He says, and I should have gotten the actual quote, so I'm sorry, but someone is always going to try to run the world, so there is no use trying to save it. Reagan is a cynic. Reagan may even be a nihilist, but she is not the kind of nihilist who runs away from things. Ron is so far gone, so worked to the bone, that he will never recover, and he just wants to start over as a new person with none of his memories. But Reagan still wants to help people. Reagan still has the pull of the side of her that's represented by Brett. She cannot leave the world behind. In the final episode, Reagan is presented with two choices. One of which is given by Ron. He says, will you erase your own mind and run away with me? And the other is presented by the Robes. The Robes are this group of demigods. It hasn't been fully explored yet, who order Cognito to do the things that they do for the betterment of humanity. They offer to make Reagan a partner, the most powerful human in the world. Reagan would be asked to make a God algorithm, an algorithm that they can use to not only modernize their control over the world, but also do better, analyze all possible paths and find the right one. But the very first use of something like this that Reagan uses is when she looks at all possible futures that she has with Ron. Robotus, renamed Alpha Beta, shows her in the simulation room all sorts of different possible futures that she has if she either goes with Ron or stays at Cognito and tries to make their relationship work there. There has been some speculation on Reddit that maybe Robotus was manipulating her, only showed her options that looked bad unless she let Ron go. But I disagree. All of the negative options that Reagan saw were her prioritizing her work over Ron, which was difficult for Reagan to watch, but also absolutely believable. I'm 100% confident that that is what she would have done. Right now they were in the honeymoon phase, but what would that relationship look like in 3 years? He doesn't want to work at Cognito, and she does. And she wants him to work at Cognito. She's supposed to be running the planet, and that's what she wants to be doing. But she always put Ron second. I believe this about Reagan, and Reagan believes it too. And in the one happy future, we see that Ron goes to Wisconsin, wipes his memory, and marries someone else. I believe that everything we saw this season showed that Ron and Reagan were a good match, but not a perfect match. And that no version of Reagan could ever be happy with a wiped mind. Or, depending on the way the science of this world works, if if she had wiped her mind, that would have been a different person. Reagan wanted to be CEO of Cognito since she was 6 years old. And yes, that's not considered to be a good thing for her, but it's certainly better than going out and doing farming. Reagan's relationship with Ron isn't healthy. She even calls him a coping mechanism at the beginning. She lies to and manipulates him over and over again. Basically, every single episode, she is trying to change him into a person that he isn't. And in the end, it's clear he is trying to change her too. He's super judgmental, which is one of the things that narratively she's supposed to be getting away from. And they can't have a real conversation. If they don't see eye to eye, they avoid each other. I do think their relationship was always doomed. I think in real life, I wouldn't necessarily call any of these things relationship enders, but in the language of television, it is. Ron wasn't enough for Reagan in that she wouldn't be happy having only him and not her job. But also, Reagan wasn't enough for Ron. Even when he wanted to run away, he still wanted to wipe his memory and become a new person. He couldn't live with himself as he was. They were never going to work. And I've seen some theories that maybe in season 4 or 5, Reagan will get to go wipe her own mind and be with Ron, you know, intercept the happy wife that we saw in The Good Future and take her place at his side. But y'all, sometimes the good guy loses. A story has to have stakes, and in this case, the stakes are Reagan deciding she has to be the person to make the hard choices, that first hard choice being leaving Ron behind. Ron is gone. Ron's body is alive, but the concept of him as a person is dead now. And in order for the story to maintain progress and have stakes, Reagan cannot be with him. All of these things, from Ron's hopeless nihilism to Reagan's manipulation and lies to the fact that they want different things in life, all pale in comparison to the big, big flag about the ending of season 8. Episode 8. Part 2, episode 8. In love triangles executed correctly, sometimes one side of them dies. And some people consider this shitty writing, but I would urge you to always think before declaring something shitty writing. The death of one side of a love triangle represents a major, major warning for the protagonist. The death of one side of a love triangle shows that the path in life that they represented is unsustainable, specifically to the survival of the protagonist. Ron worked himself so hard that he eventually considered and then followed through on committing what is effectively suicide. Barrow warned Reagan over and over that what she was doing to herself was unhealthy, and Brett basically softly reminds her of that almost every episode. We see Reagan taking better and better care of herself because of her influence from Brett, but she still found Ron attractive. She still found Ron's way of life, of cynicism and judgmentalism, something that she wanted in her life, in her mind. But look what it did to Ron, and look what it could do to Reagan. At the end of this story, I'm convinced that Cognito needs to be shut down in some way or another. Reagan has received 1 billion red flags that she shouldn't try to be CEO of Cognito and that Cognito is bad. Reagan is trying to do the right thing by trying to help the world instead of becoming the person-shaped black hole of a CEO that her father was. And we are supposed to believe that what she decided at the end of this season was the correct decision, but overall it will prove unsustainable to her. She was a bad boss before Brett was there. Barrow identified she was miserable. She was literally created to be the Cognito CEO by Rand, the narrative root of all evil. Ron's death was caused by him being slightly further along the burnout pipeline than she is, and the fact that Ron is probably supposed to represent Reagan if she had never met Brett. There's a brief few minutes in part 2, episode 8, where it seems like the Robes are actually good people. Reagan is excited to join their ranks because she wants to help the world. She wants to make the world a better place. But in the sting of episode 8 of part 2, we see that the robes are probably exactly what they look like, a shadow organization of people who are sucking humanity's teat in some way. Sucking humanity's teat is probably the wrong metaphor because I don't believe they are good people. I think Reagan will find that Cognito at its core is rotten and needs to be destroyed, that she and Brett need to get the fuck out. But overall, one of my favorite, if not my actual favorite aspects of the series is how Reagan has shown more and more agency as the series has gone along. At the very beginning, Reagan is basically a passenger in her own life. She's been manipulated by her father in every conceivable way. She has to have Brett make her friends for her. She's really incapable of having her own connections, but over the course of the series, she builds those connections herself. First through Robotus, who helps her make connections, but also by expressing genuine appreciation for others. Eventually, she takes a much more active role in the actual story. And now, at the end of season 2, she is the CEO of Cognito, and we believe she deserves it. She also has greater agency in the lives of the people around her. In the penultimate episode of season 1, part 2, she pushes Brett away during the final battle so that he can go live a happy life in the alternate universe where he creates hand puppets. And at the end of the same episode, she talks her father into going to prison because she and he both believe that it would be better for him to learn to exist on his own. Back to my point about narcissists, I think it's important to show redemption in media, even though I don't think it was handled the best here. I do prefer stories where bad family members are not forgiven just because they're family members. Looking at You, the part 2 episode where Brett is accepted by his family. A couple final notes. For one, go smash that like button on Netflix for Inside Job, because according to Shion Takeuchi on Twitter, that is how Netflix is gauging whether or not to renew the series for yet another season. I hear that it's been renewed for a second season, but I don't know if that means season 2 or season 1 part 2. So I'm not sure if there will ever be any more episodes based on what we know now. Secondly, Alex Hirsch has insisted several times on Twitter that he's nowhere near as involved in the production of Inside Job as people think he is. He's listed as an executive producer, but as far as I can tell, he's mostly there in an advisory capacity. That being said, I do think I spied a bit of Alex Hirsch's influence in season 1, part 2, and that being in the massive spike in the number of fuck Disney jokes. Alex Hirsch is a huge opponent of Disney ever since his show Gravity Falls ended. But in particular, he has been way more outspoken about how much he hated them ever since Disney canceled The Owl House. The Owl House is a show created by his fiancée, now wife, maybe? I don't know, Dana Terrace, which was removed from the Disney Channel. Well, wasn't renewed for any further seasons and was cut short because it doesn't, quote, fit with the Disney brand. The two were repeatedly gaslit and manipulated by Disney to produce 2 of their most successful animated series, and then kicked to the curb. I'm not sure if the 8 or so fuck Disney jokes we got in the second part of Inside Job were a result of Alex Hirsch, or if Shion Takeuchi wanted to show some solidarity due to what happened, but either way, I appreciate it. Anyway, that's all I had to say about Inside Job. If you liked it, please tell your friends so that they can also watch it on Netflix. We can get more views and hopefully more seasons. See you at the next one.